Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I read an interesting quote from Orest Zakydalsky, who is the senior policy advisor at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress recently in the Globe and Mail in regards to sanctions of Russian assets in Canada. And I wanted to check in with Orest and find out what his attitude is to sanctions, what he thinks about what Canada's doing, and, frankly, what's going on in Ukraine. Are we doing enough? What's going to happen, etc.? Orest, let me make sure I pronounce your name right, Orest. I apologize. Zakydalsky?
Yep, that's it.
Excellent. Is quite an interesting gentleman. He is, as I mentioned, the senior policy advisor at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. He graduated from U of T with an MA in European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. He's a strategic planner, a Canadian-Ukrainian Governance and Development Project, a researcher with the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, a researcher with the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, a researcher of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, a political analyst and Canadian bilateral election observer on the mission to Ukraine in 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2019, a senior analyst with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and a senior policy advisor with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Wow, quite the resume, sir.
Yeah, that wasn't all at once, though.
Okay. So welcome to the show, and thank you for joining
activities.
Us. Tell me, number one, what you think about sanctions. Are we doing enough?
Well, so I mean, on Russian sanctions, I think there's a couple of different issues, right? One is, are we putting on enough sanctions? And Canada has certainly implemented sanctions together with our allies on a wide range of Russian individuals and economic sectors. But the second issue is, are we implementing those sanctions effectively? And in terms of the amount of Russian assets that have been frozen in Canada, we know from the RCMP that the amount frozen is about $121 million. And that number has remained static basically since June. So despite the fact that we are adding more and more sanctions, more and more individuals and entities to our sanctions lists, the amount of money frozen remains the same. So that is a concern, and that probably does indicate that we aren't doing all that good a job at identifying and freezing these assets.
So are you saying that we're just saying stuff and not doing it?
No, we are doing some stuff, but we are not as effective at doing it as we would like to see. We would like to see the government dedicate more resources and more effort to actually identifying and freezing these assets. And then, of course, the next step will be to seize them and sell them and turn the money over to Ukraine for reconstruction.
And who does the seizing? Is that the RCMP?
The government would seize it. It would be the government would have to have an order developed to seize it and then to turn it over to Ukraine. So that is new power that the government has. That was in the last federal budget.
And how much do you think has been seized and sent to Ukraine so far?
None.
None. So
no, I don't think I know that it's none.
So we've sanctioned these people. We've frozen some assets, but we haven't done anything to actually get the assets and send it to Ukraine.
So the assets are frozen and can't be. So there's 120 million frozen. Though that money can't be moved. So the next step is to seize it, which is, it's a legal process. So it's not frankly surprising that it's taking a bit of time. And then after that, it would be, either sold or the asset turned over to Ukraine. So, but I mean, before we seize, we have to also be, better at identifying, because $120 million does not, 120 million is a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money in this context. And the kind of, worrying flag is that why has nothing been identified in, June, July, August, September, October, 6 months? Right.
Why do you think?
The number frozen in June was 123 million, and the number frozen now is 121 million. So what has been identified in the last 6 months is nothing.
So what do you think the issue is? That the government's just not doing its job, or the RCMP's not doing its job, or we don't have any more?
Well, I mean, as far as
here, what?
As far as I understand, from what I understand, the issue is that there is not the capacity to identify these assets. Frequently, they are, hidden shell companies, numbered, whatever, these sorts of things. But I mean, basically, as far as I read it right now, the way it works is that they have to be proactively disclosed. So if a bank, institution, whatever, holds an asset, they have to tell the RCMP that it's there. There's no kind of team trying to find these assets.
Well, when I think about this,
it's on the institution to tell the RCMP that it's there, rather than on the government to go and find it. And that's problematic. I mean, the government should be going out and looking for this stuff, especially because it's often shell companies and third parties and whatever, and it's hidden, and so the institution holding it may not even know that it's a sanctioned entity or a sanctioned asset, right?
But if they have a positive obligation to go out and identify it and inform the government, one would think they would do a fairly rigorous job of trying to find that. They certainly did during the truck convoy.
Well, if the government has sanctioned a large amount of individuals and entities in a short amount of time, which is what has happened here and which is very welcome, the capacity for identifying if whether any of those assets are here, I think falls on the government to go and find it. Like it is the government that has said we will, sanction, freeze, and seize these assets. So that's great. So now go and do it.
Orest, do sanctions work?
Yeah. They do.
Okay.
They do. I mean, the Russian economy is in, a lot of trouble. And the last kind of thing left for Russia is its extractive resource. Well, basically oil and gas is all that's left. I mean, the Russians relied very heavily on Western technology. Almost all of that is effectively not being, the Russians can't buy it anymore. So, sanctions are effective. The issue is that they have to be fulsome, and they have to be targeted at where the most pain can be, and that for Russia is the natural resources industry, right? So, I mean, we just saw, I think yesterday, the day before, the European Union and the G7 countries put a cap on Russian oil purchases, right? So that any country that signed on will not pay more than $60 a barrel for Russian oil. I mean, but they're still making revenue that way. So, I mean, the more effective sanction would be to not
buy the oil at all.
Buy the oil at all. Exactly.
No question. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Orest in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. We're going to talk about what's going on in Ukraine, what the Ukrainian Canadian Congress is doing, what they think that Canada is doing. Are we doing enough? Is NATO doing enough, etc.? Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking tonight with Orest Zakydalsky, who is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress in Ottawa. And we've been talking about sanctions. We're going to talk a little bit more broadly now about what's going on in Ukraine. Is Canada doing enough? Is NATO doing enough, etc.? But maybe, Orest, you could just tell me a little bit about, what's your job? What is your job, and what is the Ukrainian Canadian Congress doing in regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Are you, just trying to muster support in Canada? What's your strategic objective right now?
Well, so the Ukrainian Canadian Congress is the umbrella organization of Ukrainian community organizations in Canada. So we are a federation of all the organized community organizations throughout the country. So in terms of Ukraine, we have three really priorities. The first is to ensure as much Canadian support for Ukraine. The second is to ensure that Canada is doing enough to counter Russia. And the third is to support Ukrainian displaced people who are here in Canada. So across the country, a lot of our organizations are helping more than 70,000 Ukrainian citizens who are in Canada who have fled the war.
70,000?
Yeah.
You think there's 70,000 Ukrainians that have fled the war and are in Canada today?
No, well, we know there are. The government, the Canadian government, has a program called the Emergency Authorization for Travel program, which was instituted in March. Which for Ukrainian citizens, they can come to Canada and they have basically a 3-year visa to work, go to school, etc. And so 70,000 people have arrived on that program, over 70,000.
No, I think that the statistic is that there's more Ukrainians in Canada than anywhere other than Ukraine and Russia. Is that correct? It's the second largest diaspora?
Yeah, it's about 1.4 million, give or take, identify as Ukrainians.
And so do you think most of these people are visiting family and friends, or are they people that are just here with no support network?
It depends. It's both. Some people are here and staying with family or friends, and some are here and need kind of more community and government support. So, throughout the country, the UCC, our branches, our organizations, part of the work that we're doing in other than directly supporting Ukraine is to provide resources, provide a place to go, provide help, assistance to the people who've arrived here and who are displaced because of Russia's war. The second part of that too is with the Canada-Ukraine Foundation, the UCC has the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, where we've raised about over $40 million. About half of that has already been either spent or allocated, and that is for various humanitarian relief causes in Ukraine. So those are our two kind of community focuses. You asked me about my job, what I do. A lot of my time is spent on communication, so doing interviews like this, but a lot of it is also spent on government relations and developing policy recommendations that we would like to see the Canadian government implement.
What type of policy recommendations?
So, the most important ones are that we would like to see as much weaponry and training provided to Ukraine's armed forces, who are, heroically defending their country. The next is financial assistance to the Ukrainian government. The Russia's war, and the targeting, purposeful targeting of civilian infrastructure is taking a, horrible toll on Ukraine's economy. So we would like to see economic assistance to Ukraine. We just saw the Ukraine sovereignty bond was just issued, and that's, I think, a kind of a breakthrough idea that the Canadian government had, where Canadians could buy a bond that's basically for their purpose, a Canadian government bond, but it goes to all the money raised, and it was $500 million bond. All of that money goes to the Ukrainian government, but guaranteed by our government. So it's a way for the Ukrainians to basically raise money for the state budget. And the next, I mean, the other big policy recommendation that we have is for as tough a stand for Canada to take as tough a stand on Russia as possible. So the thing we are now pushing hard on is to have Canada recognize Russia as a state supporter of terrorism, and to list several Russian organizations, including the Russian military, as a terrorist organization. We think that it is incumbent on Canada and our allies to fully isolate Russia. I mean, we have done a lot in isolating Russia, but we certainly haven't gone as far as we could. So that is
declaring them a terrorist, a state-sponsored terrorist organization. What does that do?
So that basically isolates them diplomatically. It puts a whole bunch of restrictions on any on a whole slew of trade goods. Now we don't. What we did was we lifted most favored nation status with Russia, so Russia effectively can't really trade with Canada because there's a 30% tariff on anything that they do. But that, I mean, the next step would be basically a full trade embargo. And it lifts state immunity from Russia, which is the most kind of important thing, right? That Russian state assets that are in Canada would be subject to seizure. And so, you know,
the embassy,
or, you know, Russian state company, if they have property in Canada, buildings, whatever, all of that would be subject to seizure. So that, I think, is you know, it is Canada and other allies doing it together would you know, kind of fully isolate Russia and turn Russia into an international pariah, which is more than deserved.
You don't think they already are?
Well, I mean, not really.
Really?
Well, I mean, Canada hasn't even thrown out any Russian diplomats.
And they still went to the G20.
Sorry?
And they went to the G20. It wasn't the president, but the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The equivalent of Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Sure, Lavrov went to the G20. I mean, this is not they're more isolated than they were, but they're not fully isolated by any stretch. You know, we're one of the few countries, it's frankly kind of baffling as to why, but we are one of the few countries that hasn't thrown out any Russian diplomats. I mean, most European countries have pared the amount of Russian diplomats allowed in the country down to the bare minimum, and Canada hasn't thrown anyone out since February. So
why do you think?
I don't know. I really don't. I don't have an explanation for it.
Has the government answered you?
Not really. Not on that issue. I mean, it's a strange kind of, they don't want to do it. And
what has Canada done in regards to our embassy in Moscow?
It's there and providing the services it always provided.
So no change?
Not as far as I know.
Should there be?
Yeah, I don't understand why we still have diplomatic relations with Russia. Like, what is it we're talking about? Like, I honestly don't understand the value of having a relationship with a terrorist country. So,
and you know, we see in the newspaper and on the evening news day after day after day Russian atrocities and what I think most normal people would call terrorist acts. Why haven't they been declared a state-sponsored terrorist organization?
I think it is one of those things that unfortunately takes a long time for the idea to kind of form in policymakers' heads. So, I mean, it's been something we've been pushing on for a long time, frankly, since before the full-scale invasion. I mean, in 2014, the Russian military shot down a international civilian airliner. They have attacked citizens in the UK with, chemical weapons. I mean, these were all acts that took place before February 24th. Since then, of course, their terrorist activity has markedly increased, and we're starting to see movement in that direction. The U.S. Congress has passed resolutions in both houses calling on the president to list Russia. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly last week passed a resolution declaring Russia a terrorist state. So it's a declarative resolution, but it's nevertheless important. And also the European Parliament, which is the legislature of the EU, passed a similar resolution calling on member states to list Russia as a terrorist state. So
Canada hasn't.
The House has not passed the resolution, and the Canadian government has not listed Russia. So,
have you called upon the Canadian government to do so?
Yeah, we have called on the Canadian government to do so, and we will continue to do it. And we plan to, make this an issue on which we're going to be pushing hard over the next.
And they haven't even responded. They haven't told you why they haven't done it.
I mean, not any reason that would be a good one. I mean, they've told us that it's a very big step, and it may impede negotiations or all this. I mean, it's not. These are not. Reasons that we find compelling or ones that are would get us to change our minds, especially with momentum for doing this building in our allied countries. I think Canada needs to kind of step up here, and I mean, it would be good if we were the first to do it, and that would certainly provide an example for other countries. Just like we were the first country to issue these sovereignty bonds, and it is important that we did it for us, for Ukraine, but it's also important as an encouragement for other countries to follow Canada's example. So I think the listing as a terrorist state, I think Canada is in a position to do it, and I think it can be something that once done by someone, it kind of breaks the dam, and other countries will do it. So it is our sincere hope that Canada will be the first to do it, and we will do everything we can to make sure that happens.
Militarily, do you think Canada is doing enough?
I think that Canada is doing a lot. There will be, I think with this last budget, it'll be about $1 billion in the last year in weapons and military equipment. Crucially, one of the other very important things we're doing is providing training to Ukrainians together with the United Kingdom and the US in Great Britain now. So Canada had a long military training mission in Ukraine since 2015. They had to leave when the full-out Russian invasion started, but the training has resumed in the UK. So I would say Canada is doing a lot, and so are our allies, but we would like to see more, because the viciousness and brutality of the Russian attack is devastating to Ukrainian civilians, to Ukrainian cities and towns. I mean, this winter, Russians are now targeting electric energy and heating infrastructure to basically, I mean, the point is to kill as many civilians as possible, right? With cold and darkness, and make Ukraine unlivable. And so, the more weapons we provide and the quicker we do it, the quicker Ukraine will win this war. And, because of the way that the Russians are fighting this war, the speed and quantity of the weapons that Canada and our allies are provided at, we think needs to be increased, and that they need to be provided quicker. But I do think that we also need to acknowledge that Canada and our allies have done a lot, but
there seems to be a great resistance for Ukraine to actually attack Russia. And a lot of that sort of impetus has come from NATO countries that are supplying a lot of the arms, that they don't want escalation by way of Ukraine actually attacking Russian military or infrastructure, though there have been a few, but not a lot, across the border into Russia. Is that a right decision, do you think, given what Russia's doing in Ukraine?
No, it's not. I mean, it's a very kind of strange handcuffing of Ukraine. Now, I mean, Ukraine is hitting targets with their own weapons. They just can't use weapons we supply. Right? So no one in NATO is saying Ukraine, you can't hit Russian military installations, but you do it with the weapons that you have, that you produce, and you can't use, we will not give you weapons that you can use to target Russian targets in Russia. I think it starts with a faulty assumption that you can somehow, keep the Russians from escalating. And frankly, what we see the Russians do, I mean, I don't know what an escalation would be. I mean, they are doing everything. The kind of just wanton cruelty and brutality. I mean, what more can we provoke them to? Right? Like it's a strange, like we are saying on the one hand that we will be with Ukraine until Ukraine wins, which is a laudable thing to say, and we are certainly glad that they say it. But on the other hand, saying, okay, you have to win, but you can't do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G in order to win. So I think that, the longer this goes on, the less of that kind of restraint, or it's not even really restraint, it's sort of handcuffing the Ukrainians.
You think those handcuffs will come off eventually?
One would hope. I mean, as these kind of, as this cruelty and brutality of the Russians increases, I think it is more and more difficult to justify telling the Ukrainians, well, you can't, you can do this, but you can't do that. And the other part of it is that, like Russia already thinks that they're at war with NATO. Like it's this sort of, the Russian idea here is that Ukraine is somehow, Ukrainians don't have any agency, and it's not them. It's somehow we've convinced them to do this. So, to say, well, Ukrainians can't hit Russian targets. It's like they already think you let them, so it doesn't matter, right? So I mean, I think overall the Western support and NATO and EU and the US and Canada, overall the support has been fulsome and laudable, but there are things that we could be doing, and there are things that we could be helping the Ukrainians with, that we aren't doing, and but that's not to kind of change the overall picture, which has been, frankly, quite steadfast support for Ukraine, which is, welcome and necessary.
We're chatting tonight with Orest Zakydalsky, who is the senior policy advisor at the Ukrainian and Canadian Congress about Canadian support for Ukraine. We're going to take a break for a couple of minutes and come back. And I'm going to ask Orest, who graduated from U of T with a MA in European and Russian and Eurasian studies, what caused this? Where does it come from? What's the history behind it? Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour in Saga 960. My guest tonight is Orest Zakydalsky, who is the senior policy advisor at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress in Ottawa. Orest, you actually graduated with a master's at the U of T in European, Russian, and Eurasian studies. I think the statistic is that 1 in 4 Canadians has a blood relative living in the United States. There are more Canadians in the United States than any other country in the world. We share a large unprotected border. I understood that Russia and Ukraine were sort of similar, that something like 1 in 4 Ukrainians has a blood relative living in Russia, that people in Ukraine a lot of them spoke Russian. A lot of them went to an equivalent to the Russian Orthodox Church, that there were more Ukrainians in Russia than anywhere else in the world other than in Ukraine. What happened? Why did this? What caused this? One would have thought, they were part of one country at one point in time, Ukrainians and Russians, the USSR.
Well, they were part of one empire in the sense that Russia has a centuries-long history of colonialism of neighboring nations. And so the Soviet Union was nothing but an extension of the former Russian Empire that was dressed up in these sort of slogans of whatever socialism and friendship of nations, which was all a cover for Russian colonialism and Russian imperialism. And so what happened was that the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisies and inadequacies. The Ukrainian people declared a state, an independent state that had been, the hope and dream of generations of Ukrainians. And for a while, Russia let the Ukrainian state exist without attacking it militarily, but since 1991, in various ways, the Russian state put pressure on Ukraine to reintegrate itself with Russia, which was basically, an attempt to continue the Russian imperial or colonial project. And then in 2014, when Ukrainians decided as a sovereign people that their future was in the European Union and that they wanted to integrate with Western institutions, Russia first attacked and occupied Crimea and then Eastern Ukraine, and there was a sort of low-level war for 8 years, and then in February deciding, I don't know what the Russian thinking was or why they did it, but they decided to launch a full-out military attack on Ukraine. So this is, it is a brutal contemporary phase of centuries of Russian attempts to subjugate and colonize the Ukrainian people in Ukraine. So this is, the latest and very brutal phase of the manifestation of Russian imperialism.
It's amazing to me that they actually could think they could ever, occupy the country and then have the countrymen become citizens of this new big Russian state after what they've done. It's astonishing. In 2003, you were a researcher with the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. I think a week or two ago, there was a day in memory of the Holodomor. Some people think that what's going on now with the attack on the civilian infrastructure that you were mentioning is a potential repeat of that. Tell us all, please, what the Holodomor was, and do you think that this is potentially an attempt to repeat that?
Well, so in 1932 and 1933, the Soviet regime uh, basically created a famine in Ukraine where, between 5 and 7 million people were purposefully starved to death. Food was confiscated from villages, from farms. Farmers were forced onto collective farms. Basically, the regime took away any food and punished anyone who tried to hide any food. Now, the reason for it was because of a nationally conscious movement for Ukrainian independence that was at the time centered in the countryside, which was, the sort of where Ukrainian national consciousness was developing at the time. And so this was the Soviet attempt to destroy the Ukrainian nation and destroy the Ukrainian idea in order to subjugate the territory on which Ukrainians lived. And now, I mean, we are now seeing the Russians do the same thing using different methods because they don't control the territory, which they did at the time. Now they're bombing it. So it is the goal is the same, and the Russian idea is the same, which is to subjugate this land and its people, and the methods they're using are different, but also brutal.
Tell us what those methods are. It's
now
it's bombing electrical generating stations, power supply.
Well, it's bombing everything. It's bombing hospitals, it's bombing schools, it's bombing playgrounds, it's bombing apartment buildings, it's bombing power stations. I mean, they can't, the Ukrainian army has basically pushed them out of a lot of territory that Russia occupied in the first months of the war. February, March, there was Russian offensives that took over some territory. The Ukrainians have pushed them out. They can't fight the Ukrainian army, so they're bombing them from the sky. But they're bombing civilians. And so, that I mean, part of what the West is supplying to Ukraine and hopefully will supply more of is anti-air and air defense systems, and we have seen those be fairly effective. So these bombings are costing. Russia is losing planes and missiles and whatever, and they're not hitting not everything is hitting, but I mean, enough is getting through where it's creating a humanitarian catastrophe, and which will inevitably be worse in the winter as it gets colder. No heat, no power in a winter is devastating. Ukrainians are rebuilding this infrastructure fairly quickly, and I mean, I'm not an expert on kind of electrical power and all that stuff, but everything I've read, people are saying that the rate at which the Ukrainian electrical workers are attaching grids and renovating the power lines and all that is amazing, and that there's going to be textbooks written about how to do this stuff in wartime. But still, I mean, every week or every 10 days there's a massive Russian missile attack on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, and when they fire all at once, it's hard to you can't
stop them all.
Can't stop them all. So some of them are going to get through.
They got to be running out of armaments at some point in time. One would think and hope.
One would hope. I mean, the Russians are running out of, as far as we can, tell, and nobody really. I mean, people know, but no, I don't know. Uh, the more high tech stuff is quickly depleted, and the lower tech dumb bombs they have a ton of, right? Like that's, and so these are easier to shut down, to shoot down, and to destroy, but they have so many of them that, if you can fire 110 get through, that'll take out the power of a city for 2 days, right?
In, in 2010 to 2012, you were a researcher with the Ukrainian Jewish encounter. We see the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States recently. Some people have questioned whether it could come to Canada. Putin supposedly said that this was to denazify Ukraine, why he attacked. Is there anti-Semitism in Ukraine that justifies any kind of attack?
I mean, there is anti-Semitism in Ukraine in the same way that there's anti-Semitism everywhere, and any anti-Semitism is too much anti-Semitism. But Ukraine is no different than any European countries. It is a pluralist society. It's democratic. Its president happens to be Jewish. It's had two prime ministers who were Jewish. I mean, it's really not any different in that sense than any other pluralist democracy. And in fact, in some ways, Jewish life in Ukraine has sort of been, since independence, kind of refound, and it used to be a country where for centuries there was a large Jewish population that was murdered, much of which was murdered during the Holocaust. But since independence, the Jewish part of Ukrainian sort of civic life has been returning. Not, I mean, this Nazism charge from the Russians. I mean, I can't think of anything more absurd. But that's. I mean, they don't need a reason. They need a reason to say that they have a reason. And so they could make up whatever it is they want to make up. And if it's not Nazism, it could have been something else. So.
We're chatting today with Orest Zakydalsky. He is a senior policy advisor at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. We've talked about sanctions. We've talked about Canadian sanctioning Russian and identifying assets, but not a lot more assets, and not actually realizing on those assets and getting the cash and sending it to Ukraine. We're talking about whether Canada should declare Russia a state-sponsored terrorist organization. We've talked about Canada and whether we've been supporting Ukraine militarily enough, and we've talked about Holodomor and whether what's going on now with the attack on infrastructure in Ukraine is comparable. And we've also talked about anti-Semitism in Ukraine and whether this propaganda from Putin about denazifying Ukraine had any justification. And on all those things, Orest has been very frank and honest, and I really appreciate it. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments. And I want to ask Orest, who I guess 4 different times went to observe elections in Ukraine. I'm going to ask him about democracy and freedom in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Orest Zakydalsky, who is the senior policy advisor at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress in Ottawa. He's got an incredible resume. He's got an MA in European, Russian, and Eurasian studies. He's worked on numerous different assignments that have got to do with Canada, Ukraine, Ukrainian Jewish encounter, bilateral election observer, etc. And you actually went 4 times, 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2019, to observe elections in Ukraine. You're now the senior policy advisor at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. When you observe those elections, is Ukraine democratic? Is there freedom?
Yes and yes. I mean, it had, after independence, there was sort of tilt towards authoritarianism that was stopped by a popular revolution in 2004. It was called the Orange Revolution. Basically, a fraudulent election had to be rerun because the people went out into the streets and demanded that their voices be heard. A similar revolution called the Revolution of Dignity in the winter of 2013-2014, when the regime first reneged on a association deal they had promised to sign with the European Union, and reneged under Russian pressure, caused mass protests that the regime then tried to put down, that was unsuccessful. So Ukraine is pluralist, it's democratic, and it is free. And the problems that it has are, part of the maturing of a democracy. So if you have problems with rule of law and things like that, these are typically institutions that get better with time, and as long as you have the pluralism and the fact that society is can demand things of the government, these things are reformed and fixed, right? And so that is the process in which Ukraine was when the war started. I mean, in the kind of 8 years of a comparably low level war with Russia from 2014 to 2022, part of what the authorities were doing was this sort of reform process that was, there was all, and as there should be, a tension between civic society and the government, and the media was covering everything, everyone was yelling at each other. The civil society wanted the government to move faster, the government didn't want it, but that's what democracy is. And so
Or some
now
people,
of course there is no politics because there's a war, so everyone is focused on winning the war, as they should be, and I'm certain that they will win.
or some people have said this isn't a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is a war between democracy, or the West and Russia, or at least Ukraine is stopping and protecting democracy in the West. What do you think?
I think if Ukraine were to lose, which it won't, but if we were to presuppose that it could, that would be the beginning of a very dark era in Europe, which would show again that might makes right, and whoever is more vicious and more brutal can control territory again. Luckily we're seeing that, because of the just incredible bravery and courage of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian army, and thanks also to support from the United States, Canada, our European allies, Ukraine is winning and will win. But certainly, part of this war is a war of Russia trying to subjugate Ukraine, and part of it is this, mistaken Russian idea of imperialism and colonialism that should Ukraine fall will have very, very negative implications for the rest of Europe. And so in that sense, yes, it's a war of democracy and freedom against tyranny and oppression.
democracy and freedom against tyranny and oppression. That's a pretty good summary. Sounds like we should do a lot more, even more than we're doing right now. And I think that the role that you're playing to encourage Canada to send more arms, to seize more assets, to sell those assets and send the proceeds, to issue a sovereignty bond. And I can't agree with you more. If there's anything that is not more obvious to us, watching the scenes of devastation in Ukraine and of war crimes in Ukraine, that Russia is a state-sponsored terrorist organization. I don't know what is more obvious. And so I do agree that Canada and other countries should be stating that, and stating it loudly and clearly, and making sure that the Russian people know that this is where it has come to. I think in the end, the only way that we're going to end up having any kind of peace is if there is regime change in Russia. Putin's got to go.
One day soon, hopefully.
That's our show for tonight. Orest Zakydalsky, thank you so much for joining us from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Really appreciate everyone joining us this evening. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. Good night, everybody.